Well, as we continue to go through the story of everything, if it really is everything, then there must be a sense in which we are also in this story. And from time to time, we'll take a Sunday and just help us to see, how do we fit in the story? We've taken pains to emphasize that the Bible is not about us, it's about God. But it is written to us. And so there are faithful ways in which Scripture informs the lives that we live, that gives us an interpretive lens for this interesting world that we live in. Today, actually, we're going to look at the big questions of life, perhaps I'd say the biggest questions of life. Questions that philosophers of all sorts have tried to handle, including the great philosopher Snoopy. Where am I from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of life? There's an inquisitive boy to his mom. You won't be able to read this, so I'll read. The text under says, there's a boy at bedtime saying, "I understand how I was born. I want to know why." I thought that was great. And then lastly, this is an elderly gentleman, perhaps a little weary with life, and he comes to the proverbial fork in the road. Left, meaning of life. Right, cheese and crackers. Now, perhaps you feel a little bit like that when hearing that we're going to discuss some of these big things, conceptually today, and you might wonder, isn't that just for philosophers and maybe not for Christians, certainly not for me? But you know what? All of us, in a way, are both theologians and philosophers. All of us have what is called a worldview. A worldview. A worldview is the way in which we answer these big questions of life. And there's a complicated definition that has become all the more complicated without my glasses. That's from N.T. Wright, the first bullet. I'll let you read that. The Gary Prickett version, believe it or not, is a lot simpler. And so I just like to say that a worldview is how we try to make sense of the world and our lives in it. How we try to make sense of the world and our lives in it. If I had my glasses this morning, somebody's got... Oh, there, yes, that is easier to read. Thank you, Kathy. I'm just joking. So if I had my glasses, I'd see that was Patty in the front row. It's a way in which we see the world more clearly, and we then are able to interpret it, right? And that's the same way a worldview works. It works as a set of lenses through which it helps us to see the world, make sense of it, and interpret it. But not all worldviews are created equally. Ravi Zacharias has a way of framing up these questions that I think is quite helpful, and I owe a debt of gratitude toward that, and the speaking team at RZIM. If you ever engage with them, you know that they use an orientation typically of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And that's very simple to explain. Origin is, where did I come from? Meaning is, why am I here? Morality is, how ought I to live? And destiny, of course, is, where am I going? And really, all of the big questions of life funnel through one of these four categories, and that's really the brilliance of this kind of framework. I'm going to give you 3 examples of worldviews as well, just to, again, give you a bit of a sense of what a worldview is. The first one, and these are general categories. There are lots of different worldviews, but in general, you can fit them in one of 3 places. Firstly, God doesn't exist, only the universe exists, and we call that atheism. Secondly is that only God exists, the universe doesn't exist, and that is, although a simplification in a way, it's what many Eastern religions aspire to, and the New Age movement as well. Only God exists, the universe doesn't exist, and that includes you. The idea is to lose yourself to find yourself, so to speak, or to find God in you. And then thirdly, God and the universe exist. There are 3 monotheistic religions that believe this. That would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, be careful here. I'm not saying that they are equivalent worldviews. They are profoundly different. When we actually get into the particulars and how they view life and how one makes himself right before God, what is, the meaning and value of life are very different, but still in a broad category. They at least say God and the universe both exist. Now, you might already be able to imagine that having a worldview then does change how you perceive things. If my glasses did not actually fit with my eyes, then of course it affects how I see. If they were darkened, I'm going to see colors very differently. And so again, worldviews don't guarantee that you're seeing the world accurately. It just simply means this is how you, as a person, individually interpret the world around you. All of us have them. It's not just for philosophers. Well, our first stopping point, and this is origin because the beginning is a great place to start. Where did I come from? Well, from the atheist worldview, if you are denying the existence of God, then by extension, the only thing that exists is the universe. And so they are what we sometimes term as materialists. Material, that's all that the world is. And so that means you have a particular way of seeing origins, the origins of humanity. Humans then become simply an accident of time and matter and chance, and poof, there you are. Well, the Christian perspective, in contrast, is of course very different. And from our text this morning, if you look at verse 16, we see immediately that it says, "For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers and authorities, all things were created through him and for him." And that him, in this case, is Jesus Christ. That might be news to some of you, that Jesus is seen as creator, but really all of the Godhead is involved in creation. We see in Genesis 1 all the elements of the Godhead coming to bear upon creation. And even though they're the same in essence, they are different in function. You can turn, if you wish, to Genesis 1. I'm using Colossians 1 as a place where we'll kind of jump into these different four categories with some different scripture. It's the best place to go for origins because that's the start of Scripture, right? So we see right in verse 1, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," that establishes God as creator of all that is. Andrew spent some time in week 1 of this series looking at the attributes of God, and that's wonderful, but I can't do that this morning. I've got enough ground to cover. And by the way, if I do get going too fast, just think faster. We've got some ground to cover in a short period of time. Where I really want to turn our attention, because we're looking at human worldview, is 26 and 27. So near the end of the chapter, God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. Now, if you're wondering, I believe that. So why does this all matter? It matters because ideas always have consequences. And even within the Christian church, certainly fundamental beliefs are being assailed from both outside and inside. If you're a young person this morning, it is unlikely that you're hearing in a state school, a province school, that God is your creator. They might allow that, it doesn't really matter. Let's not talk too much about how you got here. The fact is you're here. Isn't that wonderful? Or they might even go quite adversarial and say, no, the biblical account of God being your creator is wrong. And they have another answer for that. So you're in the thick of it then. And there's a battle then for how you think. And how you think on origins and whether you recognize God as your creator will fundamentally affect every aspect of your life. And we'll see that as we go through this morning. So it does matter. These form the fundamental assumptions related to really what is the question here with origins, and that is, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human? and ideas have consequences. What are the consequences of the Christian worldview? Well, the basis for understanding humanity comes from chapter 1, 26 and 27, and we then have a foundation for three really important things, and that is human value, human dignity, and human ethics. Every human being can root their identity and worth in the fact that God made them in his image. God made them in his image. And I am going to say that, in fact, it's really the only place that you can find human value logically, is by acknowledging God as creator. G.K. Chesterton, the really interesting early 20th century British thinker, wrote that all men are equal as all pennies are equal, because the only value in any of them is that they bear the image of the king. They bear the image of the king. We'll contrast this to the materialists, and this is what we sometimes refer to, in the atheistic viewpoint. Naturalism is another word, evolutionary naturalism. Materialist is what I'm going to call it today, and that's not a consumeristic materialism, of course. This is that material is the only thing. And perhaps the foremost or most widely recognized atheist in the world is Richard Dawkins. He wrote that we animals exist for our preservation and are nothing more than our genes. We are throwaway survival machines. That's the extent. Now, that's bleak. What I do respect about it is that he actually is being honest. That given his presumptions, that is a logical conclusion. Now, it's a very bleak one, and it's not one that most people are wanting to live within. And we would say, and the Bible backs us, that it's not actually a truthful position. Well, this materialist approach presents really profound problems. Remember those three things that I said we get easily by our Christian worldview: worth and dignity and ethics. Let's see how you have to skate around this sort of thing if you're going to deny the existence of God and his creation. Take the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So you can find this on un.org, and I did go through it, not maybe every jot and tittle, but I was looking for one thing, and that was the acknowledgement of a creator, and I did not find it anywhere. So here's the preamble. The preamble says, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Article 1, there are 30 articles. We're not going through them all. Article 1 says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. I will say I don't have a problem with the aspiration. My problem is that you can't get there from here if here is godless. If you are not acknowledging that we are a created being and we owe our allegiance and our obligations to our Creator. How do you presume human dignity when you're an accident of matter, time, and chance? Think of the varied circumstances. So you're a materialist, and the varied circumstances that people are born most of the rest of the world into. It's Thanksgiving weekend, and I hope you will take time, whether it's with your family as you normally would or not. Even if it's by Zoom, be thankful for Zoom. But there are so many things that we ought to be thankful for, right? Well, if you are a materialist, think of how most people are born, the material circumstances. Are they going to look at us and look at them and see equality? I think that's going to be a hard one to win. If you're not basing dignity in that which is given by God because we are made in his image, I don't know where you find it. And I don't think that's because I'm stupid. I'm looking at this rigorously, logically, even not just spiritually, logically. You cannot derive dignity when you're an accident. And so how do we avoid then being arbitrary? How do we even differentiate, back to the UN preamble in Article 1, between human life and the rest of life on earth? The Christian has no problem doing this because we are the sole object of his creation that is made in his image. That immediately distinguishes us. Unfortunately, if you're a materialist, though, it is a very big problem indeed. If you do distinguish between animals and humans, and I think most people do, in spite of their worldview and their presumptions, you're actually then stuck with a bigger problem, which another atheist, Sam Harris, actually admits in his book, The End of Faith. He says, the problem is that whatever attributes we use to differentiate between humans and animals, like intelligence, language use, moral sentiments, and so on, will equally differentiate between human beings themselves. Do you see the logical conundrum here? The very thing that you want to establish, equality for all, is a wonderful aspiration, but you're doing it in a way that undercuts the very goal that you have, because the only thing you've got to judge this by are things that are going to separate and divide and put on a pecking order. That's just the brute fact of it. And so we have a basis for value and dignity and ethics that the materialist doesn't have. And this becomes then, of course, very problematic when working through ethical issues, the fundamental beliefs of our society are not aligned with our aspirations. Again, the aspirations aren't wrong. But how are you going to get there in godlessness when we don't have that anchor to our soul that we have value and dignity because we're made in the image of God? Well, the Christian doesn't have a problem with this. C.S. Lewis has a great quote and in a wonderful sermon called The Weight of Glory. He says, "There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses." We can rightfully say that in a way that aligns completely and logically with our worldview. Now, I'm not saying Christians are the only ones that want to love their neighbors. I'm not saying that. And there are some non-Christians that probably love their neighbor better than some Christians love their neighbor. What I am saying is you cannot logically support with your worldview system the love of your neighbor. Ideas always have consequences, and the ideas we have regarding where we come from influence then every aspect of our lives, and that leads us to meaning. Meaning. Mortimer Adler was a former editor of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and he said more consequences for thought and action follow from the affirmation or denial of God than from any other question. Now, how do we come to meaning? Snoopy pondering the meaning of life. Dogs don't actually ponder the meaning of life, by the way. That's something reserved for humans, right? No dog sits around in a circle pondering his dogginess. But we come to meaning, I think, by way of identity and value. Identity and value, who we are. When I meet a man, especially, I will often avoid asking him for a long time, to the point probably of discomfort for him, what he does. This is the first question, isn't it, that most men ask another man, what do you do? I want to know who he is, not what you do. That can come later. Who are you? Identity and value. Well, that, again, is something that we get intrinsically through creation by our Creator. Colossians verse 16b says, all things were created through him and for him. Really important distinction there. When you create something, what do you have in mind? Don't you have an end in mind? Don't you have a use in mind? After you've created it, you look at it, it's got value to it because you have invested something in it, and it's going to serve you in some way. And I'm not saying God is only He didn't create us to serve him in a sense, but in a rightful sense of that word, yes. Like, what else can we do when he is the God of all that is, but to serve him? And so we have this identity and value that comes from God because we are made through him, but also for him. And what a beautiful little phrase that is. Now, I'm going to ask you to put your thinking caps on because this is going to require a little bit of thought, but I will explain it. This is a really important thing, though. Fundamentally, the Christian worldview is traditionally, and still is, if you're Orthodox, that essence precedes existence. Essence precedes existence. What do I mean by that? Essence is who we are, and existence is what we are. So essence, Christians have always recognized that our essence is a givenness by God. So that you don't have to then become something before God. You are something in God. He created you. Before the foundations of the world, he created you. He had you in mind. So essence precedes existence. Who we are precedes what we are. We have inherent identity and value because we're made in the image of God. And when we deny God, the only logical thing we do then is flip this around. And this is exactly what our society has done. They say existence precedes essence. Now, they don't say that. You don't see this. I don't think it's a popular slogan on the bumper stickers anywhere. But this is how we live. And it's found in the 20th century existentialist movement, but really, this is just the culmination, the logical culmination of denying God. That we then, because we're not given intrinsic value, intrinsic identity, it must then be created. And so all of men outside of God are on this self-creation project. Does that make sense? And this is why then for the person outside of God, existence must precede essence. You're not anybody until you make yourself somebody. Stephen Jay Gould, an atheist scientist, says, we cannot read meaning of life passively into the facts of nature. We must construct these answers ourselves from our own wisdom and ethical sense. There is no other way. Again, I appreciate his honesty. I disagree that there's no other way, but there is no other way if you're going to deny God. You then, and isn't this what we hear time and time again? Like, this is the mantra we give our young people. You can do anything you want to do. You have to make yourself, because that is the only way you're going to find significance in your life. It isn't a given by God. You've got to make it happen. Constructing our own meaning, though, is an exercise in frustration. And I think this is one aspect. I'm not saying it's the only aspect, but I think it is a key contributor to the vast array of anxieties that we have in society today. That we don't take what is supposed to be an anchor to your soul, the givenness of your creation by God, your worth in God because you're made in his image. Viktor Frankl says, ever more people today have the means to live, but no meaning to live for. It also frustrates, though, because it really is unworkable. So imagine, what happens. So we're all on, let's say we're not in Christ, and so we're all on this sort of self-creation project, right? That's what humanism is. We're going to solve our own problems. We're going to make ourselves. What if we have conflicting meanings? What if my meaning, my truth, my values conflict with yours? Where do we go from there? Who do we turn to as an objective authority for what is right and what is wrong? If you deny the existence of God, you deny the lawgiver, then you are a lawless society. Now, it doesn't work out that way on the ground. I understand that. What does work out on the ground is its authority and power, persuasion. Who's the best salesperson? Who's got the most money, the best toys, the best authority? That's who sets the rules, right? It's ironic, really, like we have all generations, really. It's not just the millennial generation that have become social justice warriors. All generations are delusional. Every generation of man has been delusional since the beginning, that we feel that we can live apart from God. So it's not just millennials that are socially conscious. We all have been. But to think that you're going to then affect change, and this is, again, this frustration, it doesn't take long, and by long I mean at some point in your lifetime, you're going to realize that your personal preferences, your story, your truth, your values did not actually change the world. They didn't. So, we have this, it is unworkable. It's frustrating because we're not meant to concoct our own meanings. And we're not to live in this kind of confusion where I'm allowed a meaning that stands apart from truth and you're allowed a meaning and it's just our truth. There's no such thing as my truth. There is truth, and I submit to it or I reject it. If you want to tell me that you're living your story, fine, but please don't tell me that you're living your truth. Truth is truth. You can believe that 2 + 2 = 5. It doesn't make it true. Now, that's not to say, again, that non-Christians don't find meaning in this life. Humans are incredibly resourceful. They make meaning out of personal achievements. Could be material possessions. Could be community service, good things. It could be love and family. Could be power and authority. And so on and so on. There are a myriad of ways in which we make meaning in our lives. The problem is that none of these things are designed to provide us the ultimate meaning and ultimate satisfaction, even these really good things. Now, I adore my grandkids, and I have to suffer through, seeing them on this little screen on a video, like a few times a week. I'll get precious videos, and I love it. Okay, it's the best we have, and we can Skype on Sunday afternoons. I'm thankful for that. But it's not the same. But you know what? That is not my ultimate meaning in life. Even something as wonderful as grandkids. And boy, they're a great invention, I tell you. Oh, man. You parents, just hang in there. Eventually, you'll be grandparents. But they're not an ultimate thing. And it's heartbreaking when I hear story after story, sometimes, sadly, even within the church, but outside the church, people that have placed trust in things, even good things, that let them down. I hope all of you are happily married and will still be happily married 10 years from now. But if you're placing your trust, your fulfillment, your identity, your hopes and dreams in a relationship, that's faulty ground. Live the best life you can in God together and glorify Christ in your marriage, absolutely. But it's not an ultimate thing. Only God is ultimate. So we do thank God for the many good gifts He provides to us. But none of them are, at the end of the day, absolutely trustworthy. And when the meaning of our life is based upon these earthly things, they are bound to fail us in some way. So let's move to morality then. The Russian writer Dostoevsky, in his classic work Crime and Punishment, tells the story of Raskolnikov, a young man who rejects the existence of God. Now, sadly, this young man then murders an elderly woman, if you know the story. Much of the novel then becomes this working out of the internal conflict of Raskolnikov. On the one hand, if there's no God, then who's his judge? He shouldn't feel guilty. There's no absolute right or wrong. But he does feel guilty, profoundly guilty. It racks him. And it's really not until he ultimately confesses and gives his life to God that he finds contentment. He sometimes stumbles into or impulsively does these random acts of kindness. Even that isn't the balm to his soul because he knows he's done wrong. So what does this point to? Even though it's literature, I think it's good literature. It points to, I think, this truth that we are actually moral creatures. And by that, I don't mean that we do good things all the time. I don't mean that by being moral. I mean that we have a deep sense of right and wrong. We have consciences. There are times when we know that our thoughts and our words and our deeds are really, really ugly. And there are other times when our thoughts and our words and deeds we think are praiseworthy. And we're this We've got this tension going on. We have aspirations of humans, like we saw in the UN Declaration. Those are good aspirations. But if they're rootless and groundless, there's no way to bring them to pass. And there's no way for us to meet those aspirations on a personal level or on a community level without God. But that is a fundamental truth, and it's no surprise that Raskolnikov struggles with this for the bulk of the novel. We also fail. We fail to fail to do that which we aspire to. Even these good things like self-interest and heroic acts or charitable giving, we kind of understand within the Christian worldview how someone could do that and then at this very same time cheat on his taxes. Oh, sorry, Gary. Again. We have a worldview. I'm not saying it's right, of course it's not. But how do you make sense of this fact that humans can be both heroic and idiots? We have a worldview that accommodates that. Outside of Christ, we're left with the futility of our own efforts toward righteousness or the denial of God and meaning such that we can justify personal morality. You know, Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, God has put eternity in man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I love that. And we often quote the first part. The second part's just as important. Stuart McAllister puts it this way, that God's made us in a way that we have infinite longings but finite capacities. And so this human condition without God is one of restlessness and torment. Like Augustine said, that he has made us for him, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in God. But see, Paul does deal with this. He, again, pointing back to our text in verse 20. Verse 20 says, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And here comes, of course, the gospel, the beautiful gospel truth. Christians are realists. I don't think there are any people more real on the face of the earth. The accusation against us is, of course, that we construct this religion just to make ourselves feel good about a bad world. You know, we suffer, we have pain and hurt, and we die, and we want the sweet by and by story of a heaven. It's the only worldview that makes sense of the human condition, that allows you to look in the mirror and see you exactly as you are, and also know that God calls you accepted. Not because of any work of righteousness, of course, but because of Jesus Christ. That when we place our trust in his work, rather than our own, it liberates us. Philosophers and regular Joes have thought that by denying God, I'm going to have liberty. I'm going to have liberty of thought. I'm going to have liberty of action. I'm going to do what I want to do, whether that's politically or sexually. It is a false liberty. True liberty is only found in Christ. Raskolnikov, to go back to him, it's interesting to see he had that viewpoint that this was giving me a freedom, a liberation to deny God. But what he found was he was more disconnected from himself, more disconnected from his community, and more disconnected to his God until he made it right. And of course, that leads to destiny. When we're right, when we're reconciled with God, and again, not because of anything that we've done. God shows his love for us, it says in Romans 5, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And yet he has given us a destiny through that reconciliation, a sure destiny, a living hope, as Peter would call it in his letter. In verse 21, he says, and you who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, so acknowledging the ugliness of the human condition, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. Holy and blameless. That, to me, staggers me. But what a beautiful reality, and what an anchor to your soul, even this week. You know, we're not made for this world in a very real sense. You know, Peter, again, he just quoted from his letter, talks about us being strangers and aliens, that kind of language of elect sojourners through this world, right? And C.S. Lewis has a great little quote. I think this is the second time for Lewis today. If I find myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. In the atheistic worldview, physical life is all there is. And I hear more and more people not denying God because they don't want to live for him, which is true. They actually say, I don't want to live forever. I don't want to live forever. And of course you don't want to live forever, because that immediately brings a focus upon your life. It makes life. It gives life meaning. In a shallow way, sometimes, again, the Christian viewpoint or worldview is accused of being sort of, again, denying reality. And because of our eternity, it makes life now meaningless. I'll quote from Wolverine. I did this in the devotional study as well. I don't turn to movies for my theology, but actually this is a really good quote. Wolverine is a character that lives outside of time, and he struggles to make sense of his eternal life and the suffering that he's experienced, and he wants out. And his mentor, Yoshida, says to him, "Your mistake was to believe that a life without end can have no meaning. In fact, it's the only life that can." Our lives are given implicit value by our Creator. We are designed with a purpose, designed to glorify God as image bearers, and we enjoy him forever. That's by design. But the Christian faith is actually not a denial of physical life. That's not what Lewis is getting at. He's pointing to longings. He's pointing to what you don't have to drive you to Christ. And so critically, the Christian faith is not a denial of the physical life. In fact, Christ as creator, justifier, and the goal of his creation not only makes sense of our physical world and lives, it motivates our very lives. We serve more ably, love more deeply in this life through a Christian worldview, or we ought to. In closing, I just want to turn to John 13, just to really put an exclamation point on that point. And at John 13, we find Jesus, knowingly, of course, because he's the Alpha and the Omega, he knows he's about to be betrayed by one of those closest to him. And watch what he does. This is from verse 1. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. What an amazing statement. He loved them to the end. His eternity, even his eternity with us, he still couldn't get enough of us. He couldn't get enough of those that would disappoint him, that would fall asleep when he asked simply for prayer. He couldn't get enough of them. He loved them to the end, because that was his purpose, to love to the end. And he had eternity in mind, and he had eternity past in mind, and eternity future in mind when he did it. He is the Alpha and the Omega. Christians believing in eternity doesn't render life meaningless. No, it actually is the only way we make sense of the world we live in. And it's the only way that we're inspired to reach for those aspirational things, those goals that we all have, that we do share in many ways with those that live around us.